Hello, this is Kristen Dombrowski and Callie Lauer, and we would love to share with you some fascinating information we learned about executive function and reading comprehension at a recent conference we attended. First of all, let's get clear what we mean by executive functioning. I think a lot of times we use that term colloquially to mean a student who is struggling with disorganization or distraction. Executive functioning actually has to do with a specific part of the brain, the frontal lobe, and this is the part of the brain that's usually the last to come online as children grow older, and it is the most heavily involved in some of the highest order thinking that we need students to be able to do. Of all the reading skills, this will impact their comprehension more than anything, more than decoding, more than vocabulary, their comprehension. So what are some skills that come from the frontal lobe of our brain that is impacted when you have delays in executive functioning? First of all, processing speed. You might not be very fast at figuring things out. A working memory issue, holding on to multiple pieces of information in your brain at a time. It's said that we can usually only hold on to 7 bits of information at a time. Inhibition control, cognitive flexibility. So in reading, that might look like shifting from present tense to a flashback, or it might mean considering multiple definitions of a word and figuring out which definition is meant in this particular sentence in this context. The ability to plan, organize, and monitor your comprehension. So do you know why you're reading this, what you're reading it for, what your job is, and what you're supposed to be gleaning from this text, and can you hold that in your brain while you're reading? And last, social understanding. So we often find that students are great decoders and they're flying through their first couple of years of school, but then by later elementary, we notice that they are starting to struggle with executive function. Why is it that we don't see that until later elementary or until they get to SSI? A big sign of the problem is when they move from reading out loud to reading in their heads, and we lose the ability to have that conversation with them while they're reading. What we discover is that students with executive functioning delays actually don't have an inner monologue. They don't have that internal dialogue happening in their head. They don't hear themselves. They aren't having conversations with themselves. And they're able to gather bits of information, kind of like gathering ingredients, like you're going to make some bread, but then they can't connect those ingredients and pull them all together to make a whole picture. So they can tell you bits and pieces of a story, but they can't step back and tell you the whole purpose or the reason or the connection for the whole story. When you're thinking about working memory, I think it's really helpful to think of a kitchen. Some kids have a camper kitchen, and look at that tiny counter space, and that's their working memory. Other kids have an amazing picturesque Food Network kitchen with tons of counter space. If we're asking them to pull a bunch of ingredients out and put them on their counter to make comprehension happen, the students in the camper kitchen are really going to struggle. They're going to run out of counter space. They're going to start putting stuff on the floor, dropping it off the counter, and forgetting it. They can only work with that amount of space that they have. So we have some tricks to try to maximize that counter space, but more importantly, we just need to recognize that that could be the root of the problem, is they just can't hang on to so many pieces at a time. So what can we do to help students with executive function delay? As I mentioned, first of all, reduce the items on their counter. That doesn't mean lower your expectations, but there are some things that we can do to help make that counter space seem bigger. First of all, whenever possible, can you try to use placeholders or manipulatives? Can you make the learning memorable? Have some kind of personal connection, have it emotional, help kids make it memorable. I think the most important thing we can do is to make things multisensory, and that's almost like accessing hooks on the wall in your kitchen instead of just the countertop. If we can anchor the learning to a different part of the brain instead of the frontal lobe, can we use an articulatory gesture, total physical response, kinetic, auditory, visual, and that pulls from different parts of the brain, like pulling from different cabinets in the kitchen instead of just the counter. Can you help them visualize what they're learning? And I think this is also really critical in reading. Can you model your internal narrator? Can you show them what an inner monologue sounds like? Talk them through, do a think aloud, and tell them your thought process. When we got to this part of the text, I was thinking this, and then over here I got really confused, and I thought about this word, and the author might have meant it differently. The more we can do that, the better we can help them develop their own internal monologue. Here's a list of suggested accommodations. I won't go through in painful detail. Obviously, extended time is going to be helpful because their processing speed is really slow. You're going to recognize a lot of these steps here in 504s or IEPs that you've seen. They're just really great teaching practices. If you can break down the steps and make them smaller, use of graphic organizers will help them with that planning and monitoring part of their brain. Provide written instructions because once they've walked off, they might forget your verbal instructions because of working memory issues. So write them down and make them accessible asynchronously. Obviously, frequent check-ins and feedback like testing the soup to make sure all the ingredients are still on point. Our technology is our best friend. Assistive tech is going to be super helpful here. Environmental considerations is due to their lack of control. If you can reduce any distractions in the environment at all, preferential seating. And lastly, we have behavioral strategies. Short movement breaks and mindfulness activities are really helpful for all learners. I want to do a quick reading activity to demonstrate for you what the challenges might be of someone with an executive function issue. This text comes from a picture book called The Sunsets of Miss Olivia Wiggins. Miss Olivia, the nurse spoke softly, there's a lovely sunset this afternoon. The sky is streaked with pink. I'll move you over here where you can enjoy it. And he pushed her wheelchair to the west windows. You probably read that and you were able to visualize that, but a student who struggles with visualizing an inner monologue is really going to struggle with all of the pronouns that I highlighted for you here. Who is I and you and where is here and why is there a he? I thought this was a nurse and my first assumption was a nurse is a woman, so who's this guy and where are they going? So they can get really lost here. One suggestion is called syntax surgery, where we just go back and find all the pronouns and label them with Olivia and nurse and the place and replace the pronouns with the noun. We can also model our own inner monologue and what we were thinking while we read this. Here's what I pictured, which goes really well with visualizing. And when I got to the word he, I got confused. And when they said over here, here's what I thought of and what I pictured. Our students with executive functioning issues will need that help. The last slide here is just some additional reading. The book by Kelly Cartwright is recently published and has the most recent research in the active view of reading and brain science that is aligned with the science of reading, and it has a great chapter with some ideas for short little intervention activities you can do to help students improve their working memory and executive functioning skills. I also linked to a Padlet that was shared with us at the conference that has lots of different resources and research and strategies. And lastly, I really hope you click on this video to learn about total physical response. It's the idea that we can help anchor new concepts for kids by using our whole body and all of our senses to help them learn it on more than just the counter in their kitchen. I hope you learned a little something about executive function, so thanks for listening.